Hi, everybody. My name is Sean Harris. I am the co-artistic director and co-founder of Playhouse Theatre Group, and I'm also the co-artistic director of Playhouse on Park. And this winter, we have presented All Is Calm, the Christmas Truce of 1914, created by Peter Rothstein. And today's panel, I wanted to welcome everyone to. This panel, we are entitling Shared Gestures of Goodwill, the Christmas Truce in 1914, in order to give kind of a deeper backdrop and really start having a conversation about the world of the play, to give audiences an opportunity to dig deeper into the world. And we have some incredible guests today with us. It's been kind of crazy year. As we, in the beginning, when we usually plan our seasons, we planned this show to be part of our season in January of this year, okay? And we were like, this is a story that needs to be told, okay? We want to tell this story this year. And then the world, including America, turned upside down, and we realized that this was a necessity, that we needed to tell this story still this year. As theaters are closing, as we were furloughing staff, as we were figuring out what to do, one of the most, two things that have been really incredible is we kind of learned how to be scrappy and learned how to pivot and figure out how we can still produce theater in different ways. And one of the other things we did is we formed collaborations. And one of the collaborations is with West Hartford Community Interactive. So we're able to do panel discussions like this. But another one is with Our Farm, which is in Bloomfield, and where we were able to shoot this film version of All Is Calm, because we weren't able to have audiences see this. So how could we tell this story? And we had a great team come together and and we were able to produce the story in a different way. And it was a really beautiful thing. And it was, I think, much needed for this holiday time. So thank you all for watching it. And part of our theater's mission is also to engage the community in conversations and to really form connections with artists, writers, scholars, community members, so we can discuss these plays in a deeper level. So today we are incredibly honored to have just an amazing group of people on this panel. I'd like to introduce you to Peter Rothstein. He is the creator of All Is Calm, the Christmas Truce of 1914, and the artistic director of Theater La Tida in Minneapolis. Hello, Peter. Thank you very much for joining us. Hey there.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, absolutely. John McCutcheon, folk legend, John McCutcheon, who wrote a piece called Christmas in the Trenches, which was, so beautiful and such a great piece. I was reading, so many people were saying it's their favorite Christmas song. I was reading a lot about that, and I'm honored to have John McCutcheon here. Christine Pitsley is Connecticut World War I aficionado, who works at the State Library and really has a tremendous efforts in the commemoration of World War I. Hello, Christine, how are you? Good to see you, thanks for being here. And Samuel Casso, who is a theater Trinity professor and historian and novelist and an author, and an expert in Eastern European history. So thank you all very much for coming. Chuck Corsi is going to be our moderator today. Those of you might remember Chuck from moderating that brilliant panel on Kennedy, our first production. And Chuck is a board emeritus at Playhouse on Park. He was also deputy mayor of West Hartford and on the West Hartford Town Council for many years. And it's always a pleasure for Chuck to be able to run these panels for us. So without further ado, I want to send it over to Mr. Chuck Corsi. And thank you again all for being a part of this panel and for helping us enrich the experiences of audience members with bringing art, community, and conversation together. Thank you.
Thank you, Sean, and thank you for that lovely introduction of all of our members. I am a little disappointed, though, you didn't include in my introduction my critically acclaimed role in Mrs. Bob Cratchit's Wild Christmas Binge in 2009. People were very critical. Anyways, I'm so glad to be joined by all the panelists here today. We've got some wonderful group. I want to start with Peter, our playwright. Peter, tell me, what was it that inspired you to write this play, and what kind of research did you do for it, and what were some of the interesting things that you found from your research?
Well, I didn't know that John McCutcheon was going to be on this panel, but for 13 years, I've credited him with inspiring all his calm, actually. I first learned about the Christmas Truce through Christmas in the Trenches. And to be honest, I'm not sure I realized that it was based on a real event versus kind of a lovely notion of what might have happened or what could have happened. And then Stanley Weintraub published a book called Silent Night. I believe it came out in 05, 06. And I immediately purchased that book, and that was the most kind of comprehensive documentation of the truce published at that time. And I thought I really wanted to create a piece of music theater around this remarkable event that for me had been kind of denied its place in our history books. And, but for probably a number of years, I was really struggling with how I would tell the story, because the climax of this event is the lack of conflict, which doesn't make for great drama. So I knew it would need a non-traditional form. And, but to be honest, we invaded Iraq, and I remember turning to my mother while we were watching that happen in real time on the news and said, I'm going to move this project to the front burner. And I bought a plane ticket to Belgium and just began my research. And the research took me from Belgium, Brussels, to a remarkable archive center and museum called the In Flanders Field Museum in Ypres, or Ypres. I encourage anyone who loves history and World War I in particular. It's an incredible museum. And then I went into Dresden and Hamburg and Berlin, and then across the sea into England, as well as the military archives in France. So the research really, and a bit in Ireland. So Ireland, England, France, Germany, and Belgium.
Is that where the letters, a lot of the play are based on some of the letters? Where did some of those come from?
You know, from a wide range of sources. Yes, the play, for those who haven't had a chance to see it, is 100% found text. And so I created it, but I really didn't write it. It's the words of the men who were there. But it comes from letters, war journals, private journals, public journals, gravestone inscriptions, the Great World War I poets, and then of course all of the songs that they would have sung or that were certainly around in 1914. But I didn't know when I began my research that I would be able to tell the story entirely in their words, but they really came from all sorts of places. However, in Ypres, the archive center there, where I spent most of my time, was incredible, because the director, the curator of the museum, gave me kind of carte blanche and said, here's files, and no white gloves. I was just going through picking up actual documents and actual letters, but the piece actually changed a bit between 2007 when it premiered and what it is now, because I returned to Europe another handful of times, continuing to do research. And as we were reaching the centennial, a lot of those museums and archive centers were bringing more materials to the forefront. And so So as I began to find more research and also a lot of conversations with audience members, what were the questions people wanted answered after every performance? And so I thought if I could start to answer those questions inside the piece, that would make for a richer experience. So it really continued to evolve for probably 10 years.
Wow, incredible. And again, for those who haven't seen it at the Playhouse or actually online, I strongly encourage you. My family and I, we watched it the other night. It was just beautiful. It's a beautiful story for this time of the year, but it also, I think, is a beautiful story anytime. You can still go on to the website playhouseonpark.org and order the viewing of it until January 3rd is when the run stops. But absolutely a beautiful, beautiful show. We're also, and it's nice. We were all chatting just a few minutes ago before we came on air, but it's a great honor to have folk legend John McCutcheon on with us, who none of us knew until a few minutes ago is really one of your inspirations, Peter, for the show. John wrote the very popular and beautiful Christmas in the Trenches. And John, again, I'm going to ask you the same question I asked Peter. What led you? What interested you? What drove you to and inspired you to write Christmas in the Trenches?
It was back in 1984, and I was asked by my record company, Rounder Records, to put together a hammer dulcimer Christmas album. One of the many things in my toolbox is a hammer dulcimer. And I'm sure that they expected I was going to do "Hark the Herald Angels Sing" on dulcimer, and I was not at all interested in doing that. And so I was about 2 weeks from going into the studio to do this wild, eclectic holiday hammer dulcimer album, and I was playing at the University of Alabama in Birmingham. And it was about 30 minutes before showtime. And all the light and sound checks were done, and people were starting to come in and fill up seats. And I was in a backstage dressing room when all of a sudden the door exploded open, and in literally swept this old Black woman pushing a broom. And I could tell by the broom she pushed and the uniform that she wore that she was a janitor, a custodial engineer at this place. And she was a surprise to find me in this room as I was her. She said, "I'm so sorry. I'll come back when you're done. I didn't know anybody was going to be in here. It's just on my list of rooms to clean." And we started chatting and eventually got to telling stories. And it was mostly jokes, which is how storytelling sessions often start. And we were going on for 15 or 20 minutes, and she was wonderful. And eventually, you theater people will appreciate this. Someone stuck their head in the door, said 2 minutes. And I realized that I had been in this trance for the last half hour. And I said, I got to go to work now too. So it's your turn. Give me your best one. And then I amended. I said, no, tell me your favorite. And she told me the story of the Christmas Truce. And I think it was being in this trance-like receptive state where I just surrendered myself to her whenever she told a story. And I was 2 weeks out, and I knew there was something missing from this album. And I heard this story, and I'd heard of the story before, but it had been years. And I just immediately thought, that's what this recording needs, is this story in song form. And I ended up doing the shortest first set I've ever done, probably 20 minutes, because I was dying to get back to the dressing room and write this down, and wrote it during the intermission of the concert that night. And I sort of did it in reverse of Peter. I did absolutely no research. I just made up the guy's name, where he was from. The bones of the story were as the woman told me, and have done a lot of research since then. Again, thanks to Stanley Weintraub, his fabulous book, Silent Night. But most importantly, from people who have come up to me and presented me with Xeroxes of their grandfather's diary, I met a woman stood up after I sang it out in California. A German woman said, my father told me that story every night to put me to bed, and I didn't believe it was true. And most poignantly, four elderly German veterans showed up at a festival in Denmark. I was playing in 1988, and followed me around the festival. And eventually I got to meet them, and they told me that they had been there and they'd heard the song on German state radio and made the trip from Berlin to the festival. To meet the guy who told their story, which had been doubted their entire lives. In Germany, it's interesting. In Germany and France, uh, they've spent a lot of time trying to deny this ever happened. Whereas in England, it is taught in history classes to elementary school kids. I guess it's a dangerous notion that you would surrender the idea of the other, which is kind of a prerequisite for telling people to kill one another when they don't know one another, which was certainly the case in World War I. So that's kind of the story of how it happened.
That's fascinating, John. And I see you're surrounded by your trade there. Would you mind sharing some of your song with us? I think that folks would love to hear it.
Sure. And I should say, Chuck, that one of the things that attracted me about doing this is I have played in West Hartford almost annually.
Really?
For probably 30 years at the behest of the Sounding Board, one of the oldest continuously operating folk music coffee houses in America. It meets in the UU Church out there on Fern Avenue or Fern Street.
Fern Street, absolutely. Yeah. That's a great church. That's great.
So, my name is Francis Tolliver. I come from Liverpool. 2 years ago, the war was waiting for me after school. To Belgium and to Flanders, to Germany to here, I have fought for king and country I love dear. It's Christmas in the trenches where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France where still no Christmas songs were sung. Our families back in England were toasting us that day. They're brave and glorious lads so far away. Well, I was lying with my messmates on the cold and rocky ground when across the lines of battle came a most peculiar sound. Says, "Aye, now listen up, my boys," each soldier strained to hear, as one young German voice sang out so clear. "You're singing bloody well, you know," my partner says to me. Soon one by one each German voice joined in harmony. The cannons rested silent, the gas clouds rolled no more, as Christmas brought us respite from the war. Well, as soon as they were finished and the reverent pause was spent, God rest ye merry gentlemen, struck up some lads from Kent. The next they sang was Stille Nacht, 'tis silent night, says I, and in two tongues one song filled up that sky. There's someone coming towards us, the frontline sentry cried. All sights were fixed on one lone figure trudging from their side. His truce flag like a Christmas star shone on that plain so bright, as he bravely strode unarmed into the night. Soon one by one on either side walked into no man's land. With neither gun nor bayonet, we met there hand to hand. We shared some secret brandy and we wished each other well. And in a flare-lit soccer game, we gave 'em hell. traded chocolates, cigarettes, and photographs from home. These sons and fathers far away from families of their own. Young Sanders played his squeeze box. They had a violin, this curious and unlikely band of men. Soon daylight stole upon us, and France was France once more. With sad farewells, we each began to settle back to war. But the question haunted every heart that beat that wondrous night: whose family have I fixed within my sights? It was Christmas in the trenches where the frost so bitter hung. The frozen fields of France were warmed as songs of peace were sung, for the walls they'd kept between us to exact the work of war had been crumbled, gone forevermore. Oh, my name is Francis Tolliver, Liverpool I dwell. Each Christmas come since World War I, I've learned its lessons well. That the ones who call the shots won't be among the dead and lame, and on each end of the rifle we're the same.
That was just beautiful, John. Thank you so much for sharing that with us.
Oh, you're welcome.
That was just great. I want to remind folks that are viewing that if they do have any questions for Peter or John or any of our panelists, Christine and Sam coming up, please feel free to put your questions into the chat in the Q&A portion. Christine, I wanted to get your thoughts on a few things. Both Peter said something when he was talking that really struck me, that the Christmas Truce of 1914 had been denied its place in our history books. And John also talked about it on how in Germany and France that it was denied for quite some time. Can you tell us what America's sentiment and the sentiment here in Connecticut was about the war at this time, or at that time in 1914, and if news reached back here to Connecticut?
So Connecticut was a little different as far as how we approached the beginning of the war. For the most part, it was just sort of this thing that happened over there. If you read the papers from August of 1914, you're really not going to find anything on the front page. We really weren't paying attention. Here in Connecticut, it was a little different because our economy was based on the war. The Colt Firearms Manufacturing Company was getting contracts from the Russians and the Belgians and the Romanians as early as September of 1914. So arms production was really ramping up here in the state. So people here were paying attention to it because it was an economic matter. By the time Christmas came around, you were hearing daily stories, but to Americans, it was still something over there. It was not something that anyone here in America thought we were going to get into. It wasn't really until 1915 that there became this movement towards being prepared, and it was called the preparedness movement, and it was Teddy Roosevelt was one of the biggest proponents, and Connecticut was also a huge proponent of that. So it really wasn't until 16 that anybody here thought it was going to happen. Even with the sinking of the Lusitania, there were people that thought we were going to get into the war, but President Wilson won re-election in 1916 on the idea that he kept us out of war. So it really was something over there. And the truce really didn't make the papers here. It was a one line, there were reports of a truce until March of 1915, when some American reporters reported on some of the Americans that were involved in some of the truces along the line in the French Foreign Legion. So we really weren't paying attention to it at all.
Wow. So once we did get involved, the United States did get involved in the Great War. You've done some studying of the 26th Division, I guess the New England National Guard troops who fought there. Can you tell me a little bit about their experience? And that you had shared with me earlier that they weren't very well liked.
No. The 26th was made up of all the National Guard troops. There was the 101st and 104th were Massachusetts troops. The 102nd was all Connecticut troops, and the 103rd was Maine, New Hampshire, and Rhode Island. They were commanded by Clarence Ransom Edwards, who the only statue in the United States of this man is at the state capitol here in Connecticut. He was an upperclassman, when General Pershing, who was the supreme commander of the Allied force or the American forces, was an underclassman. So there was a lot of dislike between the two men, plus the fact that the regular army saw these National Guard troops as being civilian soldiers. So they had a lot going against them going into the war, but they were really well trained. They spent almost as much time on the front lines as some of the regular army troops. And they ended up being blackballed, and some of the officers were removed in November for fraternization with the Germans. They were thought of as being too soft on the Germans. The 102nd, a story is told in France by the French people that in a place called Seicheprey, which is where the first German offensive against American troops took place, which was against Connecticut troops, there was a water source, a small stream in the woods in between the Germans and the Americans. And that this was a place of truce between the troops. The troops, German and American, would go and get water or wash their clothes. And there was an understanding that no one would shoot at each other when this occurred. I've never heard that here, but it's something that the French people talk about and French historians have recorded. And I think that I think our troops learned about they knew about the Christmas truce, and it was this act of humanity. And you're looking across no man's land, seeing someone who looks just like you, somebody who may have, worked in America, and I think they took it to heart, and they took that spirit of the Christmas truce with them and treated German soldiers as they would want to be treated.
Wow, that's amazing. Sam, I want to ask you to follow up on that, because your experience in European history, I think you could shed some light on this. Can we agree, or do you think that the Christmas truce was evidence that these ordinary soldiers on both sides, or ordinary men on both sides of the battle, had turned anti-war, that there was an anti-war sentiment among them?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think we have to distinguish between how the men felt at the time and how the Christmas truce was remembered after the war. After the war, you began to get very quickly, especially in countries like France, Britain, and the United States, you began to get a narrative which really regarded the war as a unfortunate swindle perpetrated on the young and the weak by the elites, by profiteers, Ironically, a novel like All Quiet on the Western Front by Erich Maria Remarque, a German novel, was actually much more popular in the US, Britain, and France than it was in Germany itself. But this narrative that the war had been some sort of a trick, some sort of a huge deception, really took hold. And it was then taken up by many scholars over the years. And in this narrative, the Christmas Truce is exhibit number one, that ordinary soldiers left to their own didn't want to fight, were ready to embrace their opponents. But if you kind of dig deeper into what the moods were at the time in 1914, 1915, during the war itself, what the Christmas truce really means is, of course, the existence of a yearning for decency and contact, but it didn't mean that the troops didn't want to fight. In the case of Great Britain, Great Britain, given what happened in Belgium, had no choice but to get into that war. And there was this real consciousness of not only the brazen German violation of a sacred treaty, and in those days treaties meant more than they mean today, but there was this consciousness of real German atrocities in Belgium. The Germans were furious that the Belgians were resisting them and disrupting their timetable. And in August and September 1914, 6,000 Belgian civilians were killed. And so these soldiers who participated in the Christmas truce, they were perfectly happy to embrace the Germans on the other side of the line, but they really didn't doubt the rightness of their cause. And one other thing that I think we should mention is that in December 1914, most of the British soldiers who were embracing the Germans and playing soccer with them were troops of the regular British Army and reservists. They were professional soldiers. And the Kitchener Army, the mass army, was still in training. They didn't really get committed to action on any scale until the late 1915. And so the ethos of these professional soldiers was much more willing to, see the enemy as a colleague, as somebody that you could talk to, as somebody who is doing his job just as you're doing your job. But that's before the introduction of poison gas. That's before the growing brutalization of the war. And the hatred really deepened. And already in 1914, there was much less fraternization with the French and the Germans than there was between the British and the Germans. There was some, but it was not as much. So the Christmas truce is important. It's important to remember it, but it doesn't mean that the soldiers at the time let it affect their basic attitude toward the rightness of their cause.
Wow, that's fascinating. And Peter, actually, it reminds me in the play, you can see the transformation from some of these groups. Is very optimistic in seeing this as their duty as they're leaving England, to how they change, how the war has changed them. Can you talk a bit about that?
Absolutely. It's so interesting. Thank you, fellow panelists, to hear your expertise around this event. Yeah, I believe that that especially on the British side, and again, the real historians, correct me if I'm wrong, but they began to feel more in common with their enemy than with their commanding officers, because the Germans had captured all of the high ground early in the war. They captured the high ground and they captured the churches. So they had steeples, so they had lookout towers. So the German trenches were much better. The living conditions were much better for the Germans than they were for the Allied side, where the men were living in water up to their knees. We think that first winter of the war, more men were dying from malnutrition and influenza and infection than they were from enemy combat. And they were all on the British side promised they would be home by Christmas. So as winter set in and they realized they were not going home for Christmas, I think they felt like they had more in common with the foot soldier across no man's land than they did with their commanding officers, feeling that they had been lied to. And certainly, I've never read this in a history book, but looking at a lot of the accounts, I don't believe the truce would have happened to the level it happened were it not for music. Because as winter set in, the men began to hold these concerts back and forth. And Captain Sir Edward Hulse from the Scots Guards, he has probably the most comprehensive single account of the truce in a letter he wrote home to his mother. Edward Hulse died in combat in March of 1915, but he speaks of these round robins, these concerts where they would communicate and call for encore, and that music being a universal language, I think, is what began to build this sense of camaraderie and this sense of trust. And that while I agree, I don't think the Christmas truce was reflection of necessarily an anti-war ideology or a shift in sentiment, but I do think we did see a shift in attitude towards what they had been promised and how they were being cared for, and began to feel a much more sense of simpatico and allegiance with their enemy than they did with those in charge of the British Army in particular.
I just like to jump in
Sure.
in here and add that there are accounts that about the Christmas truce that show that in many sectors of the front, the British soldiers believed that because their opponents were Saxons and Bavarians and Westphalians and not Prussians, they were somehow good guys. That it was easier to fraternize with them than it would have been with Prussian units. The German army in 1914 especially was extremely territorial. The divisions were based on territory. So the idea was that it was the Prussians and Prussian militarism that was responsible for the atrocities. And these Saxon guys, half of them had been waiters in London before the war, and they rooted for Tottenham and they rooted for Arsenal. And these were people that you could talk to.
Wow, that's fascinating.
And I just, to add to that, that kind of sentiment carried all the way through to when the Americans came, and the Americans had no problem with the Saxons. They were like considered the best of the bunch, where the Prussians were the feared troops, the ones you weren't going to be nice to.
Wow, that's incredible. John, I read in doing some research for today, I read that you participated in the National World War I Museum's centennial celebration. They had a concert.
They did.
Could you tell us a little bit about that? And, seeing that that was just a couple of years ago or last year.
It was 2014.
Oh, 2014. Okay.
Which was the centennial.
Yeah.
It was interesting because it was actually a part of a very busy 2-week period for me, which had literally all across this country, different groups celebrating this, ending up at Cooper Union with Veterans for Peace doing a big concert in New York City. I had played at the National World War I Museum before, never sponsored by the museum itself, but it has a beautiful auditorium that a local concert promoter decided, oh, wouldn't this be cool to put John McCutcheon in the World War I Museum? And they just rented out the space. But at the for the centennial, I got there early, so I was really given the Cook's tour, and it's a remarkable place because they have trenches set up, and they have some extensive historical stuff that was there. One of the most obvious things, and Weintraub talks about this as well, was I think what the play does and what my song does is sort of perpetuate this idea that it was a small handful of people who participated in this, whereas the trenches were hundreds of miles long. And as the play references toward the end, almost no advances were made on either side for many years. It was a horrible place to be. But it was impossible to see a group of men over here all of a sudden out in no man's land, and obviously they're from opposite sides, and not see it and then participate in it by some estimates. Peter, please correct me if I'm wrong, and you too, Sam. I believe that Weintraub determined that there were well over 100,000 men that actually took part in this because it just spread along the trenches. It was impossible not to see it.
Wow.
Yeah,
Yeah,
there were
that's
4 corps.
Go ahead, Sam.
There were about 4 different Army corps that took part in it. There were 2 Army corps that didn't, for reasons that we can't figure out, because so much of this was spontaneous. It wasn't planned. But most of the British Expeditionary Force took part in it.
Wow. Peter, do you have
And
something
they
you want to
also,
add?
I believe it's Weintraub as well, who thinks there was probably 6 or 7 different separate truces along the front. So it wasn't necessarily one large gathering, and some of them were just an agreed to ceasefire, where commanding officers met and negotiated a period of time where there would be a ceasefire, where other places along the front where we have the famous soccer game, or singing carols, exchanging gifts. Some of them lasted the evening of Christmas Eve, some lasted Christmas Day. We know from documents that at least one of the truces lasted until New Year's Day, because they switched rotation to get new men to the front line because the men were simply refusing to get the war back on track. So we know from one war document that they rotated a new regiment to the front line on New Year's Day in hopes of getting the machine back in motion. But I think it's important for people to realize that while Weintraub credits over 100,000 men, that it's not necessarily one party of 100,000 men. There were various levels of truce that were happening that year, and never happened again anywhere near that scale.
Christine, you actually brought students over to the site, to the trenches. There was just a wonderful article in the Current that I was reading. Could you talk a little bit about that experience, about the digging project that you had, and really what a great experience it was for not only you but the students you brought along?
Yeah, it was amazing. I brought 15 students from across Connecticut to the village of Seicheprey, which is where the first German offensive was. And before we went, we had each of the students research a soldier from their town that had fought at Seicheprey, because it was really important for these kids. You can watch movies, you can read all about it, but until you put yourself in somebody's shoes, you're not going to understand the impact that this particular war had, or any war. So working with the French government and the local government and French students, we restored probably somewhere between 50 and 100 meters of trench line in the Bois de Jury, which was one of the woods where New England troops were living during this battle. And to the kids, it was the most amazing experience of my life to see them, understand what this was. The very first thing we did is we lined all the kids up in one of the overgrown trenches, and one of our military historians that was working with us told them they were going to go over the top. And the kids are like, well, let me put my backpack down. And he's like, no, you have to, everything you have with you, you keep on your back. And they all crouched, and he blew the trench whistle and told them to run for the wood line. And the kids told us afterwards that their hearts were pounding. They knew there was no artillery fire or gunfire waiting for them, but their hearts were still pounding, and they actually understood what it was like those Connecticut men researched to go over the top. And it just, over the course of 2 weeks, clearing these trenches, we found a spoon with a bullet hole through it. And one of my students actually wrote his college essay on that, because they understood that that spoon was held up over a trench to check for snipers. And, you know,
Wow.
yeah, it was, the trip had an impact on students that I never could have imagined. It was incredible, and we can't wait to bring the French students here. We were supposed to do that this summer, but COVID kind of got in the way of that. So we hope to keep this going, because it's a really important way for students to learn about what these guys endured.
Thank you. That's fabulous. Yeah, I hope to have them over. I have a question from one of our audience members for Peter and John, either one. And the questioner asks, have either of you seen the Kevin Putz opera Silent Night? The person who asked the question attended the European premiere in 2014, and they were stunned and moved. And it was so poignant for the European audience. Is that something either of you have seen or heard of?
Yeah, I was actually at the world premiere of it, because it premiered here in Minnesota. I work a lot with Minnesota Opera. So actually the director of Minnesota Opera came to the world premiere of All Is Calm, and then moved on and commissioned Silent Night about 3 months later, actually. The opera is gorgeous. The Kevin Putz opera is just stunning. It's based on the French film Joyeux Noël. And actually, when I was doing my research in Ypres, the filmmakers for Joyeux Noël were there at the same time, conducting their research for that beautiful movie. So I highly recommend the film that the opera is based on. But Silent Night has had really a wonderful life as an opera. I've seen it a couple of times now.
Oh, that's great. John, have you seen that?
I haven't. I was invited to the world premiere, but I had a conflict. It's a professional problem with me.
Actually, I've got a question for you from another viewer, and I hope I get this right. What inspired you to blend the Minstrel Boy melody line at the end of Christmas in the Trenches?
Well, actually, in the recording and my normal performance, I actually included more than once, but I was trying to abridge it out of respect for all the other panelists here. You know, I really don't know. It was just something that the song was written very quickly. Those of you who are writers out there every writer I know has had an experience where there's some things you write and other things you simply seem to write down. And when I was working out the guitar accompaniment for it, I knew that there needed to be a break between the time of when they were in the truce and when the sun came up the next day. The Minstrel Boy is an Irish tune that goes, the minstrel boy to the war has gone, in the ranks of death you'll find him. And it would have been a piece that would have been known to the men at the time. And it just, it was one of those spontaneous things. And then I reprised it at the end.
Beautiful. Thank you. And again, I remind folks that if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. Sam, our neighbor down the street on Farmington Avenue in Hartford, Mark Twain, he was fond of saying that history doesn't repeat itself, but it certainly does rhyme. In World War I, we saw many of the seeds of World War II. Can you talk a little bit about, to what degree World War I explained the outbreak of World War II?
Looking back, of course, it's very easy to see how, in many ways, World War I helped set off World War II. The whole issue of what the Germans felt to be a humiliating peace treaty, the signing of the war guilt clause. Germany was forced to sign an article saying that they bore sole responsibility for the war, which justified reparations, which allegedly crippled the German economy, which set the stage for Hitler. That's one level of explanation for World War II. A second level of explanation is that World War I caused the Russian Revolution, which in turn set up the monster of a worldwide communist conspiracy, which made it easier for many people to support the Mussolinis and the Hitlers and fascist movements around the world. And a third level of explanation is that by shaking and disrupting the pre-1914 world economy, World War I set the stage for the Depression, which then leads to World War II. So those are some of the channels of explanation which could link World War I and World War II. But if you look at it more closely, there are alternative scenarios. World War I did not have to lead to World War II. World War II was not inevitable. Had it not been for the Great Depression, Hitler never would have come to power. In the elections of 1928, which was a year of economic stabilization in the Weimar Republic, the Nazis only got 2.8% of the vote. The causes of the Great Depression were due in very large part to the stupidity and short-sightedness of policymakers in America and France, and to the short-sightedness of American bankers. World War I did not emasculate Germany to the extent that many people believe. In many ways, World War I left Germany relatively stronger in Europe because Germany no longer had to face a Russian Empire on our eastern borders. World War I did not wreck the German economy. The day of the armistice, on November 11th, 1918, there were 2 million German troops on French and Belgian territory. How many enemy soldiers were on German territory? 0. The fact that Germany would ask for an armistice when there was not one enemy soldier on her territory set the stage for the so-called Dolchstoßlegende, the stab in the back legend, which was a very important factor in contributing to Hitler's subsequent popularity. But had the Weimar Republic been allowed to stabilize, had the German economy been allowed to develop as it developed after World War II, it's highly possible that democracy would have triumphed in Germany. You never would have heard of the Nazis, and World War II would not have broken out.
Wow. Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. Peter, actually, I have a question from one of the actors that was in the show. And the question is, did you always know you wanted to create the show using the real words of those who were there, or was there some sort of aha moment when you came to that decision?
Yeah, that is a good question. When I began my research, I didn't think I would be able to tell the story entirely in their words. And as I began to dig into the research more, and John referenced this of news of the truce, while it made the home front in England, there was also an attempt to squash news of the truce reaching the home front because the propaganda machine of World War I was so incredibly strong. And in fact, modern day propaganda, some theorists would say, began with World War I. And so the last thing you wanted was to humanize the enemy, because the propaganda machine had convinced, certainly on the British side, that the Germans were rapists and baby killers. And so they were editing letters back home by November. The envelopes that the soldiers wrote on you were not able to seal them. And so I thought, as I began to do more research about this story having been denied its place in history in some ways, it would be more powerful if I could tell it in their words than any fictitious characters that I would create in order to tell the story. And so that's what I set out to do. And having, been thinking about it for probably 5 years, by the time I gathered my research, I actually sat down and wrote it in probably 24 hours. The piece just fell into place because of the amount of research and that decision to tell it in their words. And certainly not everyone who's cited inside the play was part of the Christmas Truce, right? Siegfried Sassoon, Francis Ledwidge, some of the poets were not necessarily part of the truce. However, they were all on the Western Front in 1914 and the moments leading up to the truce. And the same thing with music. We don't know exactly. We know some of the carols they would have sung. We know some of the popular songs. All of these songs existed by 1914 and were part of the canon of trench songs, but whether or not those songs were actually sung. The French opera singer, for example, I was able to get into the archives of Paris Opera to figure out his career and what he had performed with the opera, but we don't know if "O Holy Night," for example, was what the song he had sung as part of the truce. So certainly there is artistic choices that are being made in the compilation of all of that, but I believe it has much more power than a piece of fiction surrounding the event.
Absolutely, it was very powerful. We're at the top of the hour, and I don't think we have any more questions. I'll ask each of the panelists if you have any closing thoughts that you wanted to share. And actually, Sam, I'll start with you.
Yeah, when I think of the Christmas Truce and when I think of this beautiful play that I saw, I find it very inspiring because it's a reminder that even in the worst times, there's this yearning for evidence of decency and humanity. There's always this hope that the enemy is not the abstract monster that propaganda makes him out to be, but that the enemy is a fellow human being, just like yourself. So when I think of the Christmas Truce, I think of it as kind of a pilot light, a reminder that one can always hope to return to what Lincoln would call the better angels of our nature. I find the story of the Christmas Truce especially poignant in view of the fact that World War I as a whole did so much damage to European civilization, to European culture, the brutality and the violence. And what many people forget is that the killing didn't end in 1918. After the armistice, you had a bloody civil war in Eastern Europe, which killed another 5 million people. You had typhus and influenza epidemics. So if you look at this record of brutality and violence and suffering and killing, followed, of course, by even more killing in World War II, the Christmas Truce is a reminder that it's always possible to strive for something better.
Thanks, Sam. Christine?
Yeah, I agree with Sam, and I want to thank Peter for writing this beautiful play and for the Playhouse on Park for producing it, because it really is something we need this year, that kind of, that beautiful piece of humanity. And to me, who has been studying World War I and studying the voices of the men and women who served on the front lines, it was really moving. And I hope people continue to look at World War I. The commemoration is over. A lot of people are now forgetting about it, and it's kind of fading into obscurity again. And I hope, that this play can continue and people can continue to look and learn from this war, because it affected everything we're going through today, from how we deal with pandemics to issues in the Middle East to just how we deal with each other as human beings. So thank you all, and thank you for allowing me to be a part of this amazing panel discussion.
Thank you, Christine. And John.
When I first wrote this song and started singing it, I had assumed that I would only sing it during the holiday season and then pack it away with the wrapping paper and the ribbons, only to dig it up again 10 or 11 months later. But I was quickly educated by my audiences, which is something that all writers would do well to pay attention to, that this was a story that deserved, and in fact needed, to be told 365 days a year. And I think for me, the story is not only trying to shine a light on an historic event that most people don't know happened, but also in this time in which we live, where we have caricatures and propaganda about fellow Americans and who they are and what they think, I think this whole notion of the common humanity is something that has a lot to tell and teach us. And I hope that the people who are lucky enough to see this play will take that with them.
Thanks, John. And finally, Peter.
Yeah, first, kudos to the whole team who built this production. It was really beautifully done, and as a writer, it's just a joy to see how other artists interpret your work and bring it to life. And it was really moving to watch what the creative team and the cast and singers did with your production. When I direct the piece, I spent some time in the moment at the beginning of the truce trying to make the cast understand what courage that must have taken. We think of that one British soldier. He's not just trusting that one person across no man's land isn't going to fire, but that hundreds, if not thousands of men, he's trusting that not one of them in that moment is going to choose to fire when chances are they've lost a father, a brother, a best friend to me. And the amount of courage that it would have taken, trust humanity is almost incomprehensible. And when I think about that in my own life and the divisions we build with colleagues or family or friends following a tumultuous election and a really challenging time for our country and the world. In to allow courage to exercise peace than to exercise war. And I hope that that's a challenge for all of us to have the courage to choose peace.
Thanks, Peter. Wow. And thank you to all of our panelists, Peter, Christine, John, Sam. I know I certainly learned a lot over the last hour, and I'm sure our audience did. Thank you so much. Also want to thank all of you who have tuned in this afternoon for this great presentation. And also thank our community for supporting the Playhouse on Park. We all know that the pandemic has been especially hurtful and harmful to the arts communities. And I just want to say how proud I am of the great work that Darlene, Tracy, and Sean have done at the Playhouse in adapting. They didn't know they were not a film company 9 months ago. And they have shown that through their hard work and dedication and being able to adapt, that they continue to bring art to our community, and that's so important. And also, I'd like to thank Jennifer Evans and her friends at West Hartford Interactive for bringing this to the residents of West Hartford, both on the YouTube channel and on Comcast and on the Playhouse's website. And finally, I encourage folks, if they haven't seen the show, to please go to playhouseonpark.org and sign up to watch the show. It's really moving, and it's still available for the next week through to January 3rd. So with that, I wish you all a pleasant evening. And again, thanks for joining us.